The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the webinar, School Security and Emergency Preparedness, Threats, Trends, and Best Practices. Hello, I'm Karen McKelvey, the coordinator of webinar services for PSI, and on behalf of all of us at PSI, we thank you for attending. As school safety issues increasingly move from the schoolhouse to the courthouses and on to the courts of public opinion, school leaders need to be able to distinguish fads and fiction from facts and best practices. School administrators, crisis teams, and school safety professionals must base safety and emergency preparedness decisions on best practices and reasonableness for pre-K through 12 school settings. This webinar will strengthen participants' abilities to identify current and emergency school security threats, discuss current trends and shifts in school safety leadership at the schoolhouse, courthouse, and court of public opinion levels, and list practical, cost-effective, and reasonable school security and emergency preparedness best practices. Our presenter, Kenneth S. Trump, M.P.A., is the president of National School Safety and Security Services, which is a Cleveland-based national firm specializing in school security, emergency preparedness, litigation consulting, and related safety consulting and training. Ken began his work in school safety as an officer, investigator, and youth gang unit supervisor for the Cleveland City School Safety Division, and as a suburban Cleveland School Security Director and Assistant Gang Task Force Director. As one of the leading U.S. school safety experts, Ken has gone on to serve more than 30 years in the school safety profession, where he has worked with school and public safety officials from all 50 states and internationally. Ken is also the author, co-author, and/or editor of 3 books, 5 book chapters, and more than 450 articles on school safety and emergency preparedness issues. He is one of the most widely quoted school safety experts, appearing on all national news networks and cable TV, and in top market newspapers. Ken is also a 4-time invited congressional witness, testifying on school safety and emergency preparedness issues. And he testified on the role of federal government in bullying at a hearing of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. During this presentation, the audience will be electronically muted. If you have questions, use the chat function there on your right to submit your questions. Ken will answer as many as possible in the time allotted near the end of the webinar. We are recording this presentation for those who couldn't register or attend. PSI's contact information will be on the last slide. And now, on behalf of all of us at PSI, I am so pleased to present Mr. Kenneth Trump.
Thank you, Karen and Tammy, and I'm really here today appreciative of the opportunity to join with PSI and thank longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Steve Rosenberg, with the opportunity here. PSI is a leader in health, psychological, and support services for schools, and it's a rare opportunity that I get to pair with such a respected firm, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so. This afternoon, we're going to take a look at school security and emergency preparedness trends, threats, and best practices, and share some of the lessons learned that we've seen in best practices and focus that on the national trends as I've seen them unfold in recent years. It's certainly an emotional issue, an evolving issue, and something where there's a lot of information, misinformation, and dueling competitive information. As one school administrator told me, there's so much information out there. That's the good thing. It's also the bad thing because I just don't know who to believe. And many of the best practices that were actually originated back in the days of Sandy Hook and more so from Columbine era are still applicable to schools today. But there are also some different schools of thought and some different competing interests and some outside influences that make it really hard for our education staff, our first responders, our public safety officials to try to get their arms around what is the best thing to do. How do we create a safe and secure school, both psychologically and from a physical security end? How do we prepare for emergencies? And how do we do that without crossing a line of reasonableness and without doing more harm than we are doing good as we try to address the various threats, the changing threats, and still do that within the context of day-to-day educational priorities that we have to implement. I would like to just stress that the information in this webinar is not provided as legal advice or professional advice on specific situations. Each and every individual concern should always be directed toward qualified professionals in the appropriate area on an individual and formal consultation basis. School safety situations can be very unique to not only each school district, but each school and school community. So while we're going to talk about some best practices and broader trends, it's very important that your specific concerns, issues, and decisions are made based upon your local analysis and cooperation with your partners in the community, first responders, mental health, expert consultants in prevention, intervention, psychological, and other safety services, and reviewed by your legal counsel and insurance carriers, as we're going to talk about the litigation end of things today. It's important to remember that school safety is a safety issue first and foremost. It's also an area for increased litigation in both the court of public opinion and the court of law at the state and federal areas. So please know that what we share with you today needs to be taken into context here in this webinar, but more so tailored and evaluated based on your individual situations at a point of time. I appreciate the introduction and have had the opportunity to spend more than 30 years in the school safety, security, and emergency preparedness field, starting on the Cleveland City School System in their safety and security division as an investigator, a youth gang unit coordinator, then as a suburban school security director, and have had the opportunity from the consulting end to work with schools from the Aleutian Islands of Alaska with one school with 125 kids on an island, to the fourth largest school system in the nation that had its own school police department and school district police SWAT team. The districts that we've worked with over the years on a consulting training basis have tended to be, on average, smaller to mid-sized schools that don't have their own day-to-day resources or do have limited resources there. So from the context that I'll present today, really comes from a very diverse opportunity over the years to see many different contexts of working in schools, urban, suburban, rural, public, private, from the schools that charge $18,000, $20,000 a year in independent private schools to some of your more impoverished, struggling communities along the way. So it's been an interesting opportunity, an evolving one over a period of time. I spent yesterday and today largely dealing with the media. This CNN story highlights a story that I originally worked with Miami Herald on last week when they called about a Christian school in Florida that is selling bulletproof panels for students' backpacks. One of the parents at the school, according to the reports, has a business interest there, and this story came to public light and caught on like wildfire. And I thought it was worthy just to take a couple minutes to talk about this from several perspectives. A story that started locally in Florida, bumped into the Miami Herald newspaper, and within a couple of days was on CNN. I was just talking with the news team at NBC National News, as well as some different affiliates today. And it made me think that if I'm getting these interviews, just about some comments that I made in one interview, how that affects the people who are at the school level, who work there on a day-to-day basis. And if you could just place yourself in a school and think that one discipline incident that's caught on video on a kid's cell phone, put up to YouTube, hits the local news, then the national news, spreads throughout the community, hits social media, and literally can become a national story in hours. And the same holds true with rumors, misinformation that used to take days and weeks to spread out in school communities with threats and other safety concerns can now spread within seconds and minutes and hours. And this is the world that we're living in. This is one of the biggest differences that I've seen since I started in this field more than 30 years ago. The impact of electronic communications, digital communications, social media has added a whole new dimension to school safety, to where we not only have to manage the safety incidents, investigations, and issues, but we also have to manage crisis communications and school community relations, and perhaps national and international media coverage for something that started in a classroom down the hallway at 9:30 in the morning that happened to be caught on video, or in this case, something that got legs, as they say in the media industry, and spread like wildfire in a very short period of time. This incident also really brings into focus this whole issue of reasonableness and a comprehensive approach to school safety. My point with the bulletproof backpacks that I've shared with the media when they asked my opinion on this is, if we say that students need to be equipped with bulletproof backpacks, wouldn't they also need to be equipped with a bulletproof front pack, a bulletproof helmet, and bulletproof gear all the way from their head to the toe? What point do we cross that line of reasonableness, taking reasonable risk reduction measures, taking prevention and preparedness measures, diversifying that, pushing the envelope a little bit, but not crossing that line of where we create anxiety, perhaps some psychological stress, communicate to our children that they're not safe anywhere and they need a bulletproof backpack to leave their homes, to go to school, to be in the building each day. And the other piece of that is any suggestion that you see that comes up with hardware, equipment, and products may very well be well intended, but the question is it well thought out? How would this be implemented in a school? So I urge you, as you look at what you do in your school community, or what you consider as individual school districts, school boards, safety agencies, community support staff, the first question I always ask is, when I hear about the different products and gadgets and gurus that pop up, is how would this really work in a school? And in this case, I could just had a vision of a middle school student running down through the gym with a basketball in hand in a classroom type setting, having to have a bulletproof backpack on the front, on the back, on the side, on top of their head. It just didn't make a lot of sense. So understand that these issues and dynamics that occur in a school can take off like wildfire, and that they also, as you consider various proposals, you need to think about, are we doing more harm if we do this? Is this the best use of scarce and limited resources? Are we focusing on our priorities and some of the things that we'll be discussing today? Or is this a fad, a quick fix, some type of emotional security blanket that really, if anything, might make people feel safer, but probably wouldn't actually truly make them physically safer, even in a worst case scenario, which fortunately we know in context would not likely happen in most of our schools anyway. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'd like to share with you today some trending issues in school safety that I've seen over the last 3 to 5 years at various points, and talk about each of these individually as we go through the remainder of our session. The first is a tunnel vision focus on active shooters, a skewed focus on security products, equipment, and physical security measures, an uptick anecdotally in sexual assaults, gun confiscations in schools, and teen suicide issues, threat assessment, bomb threats, shooting threats, but particularly electronic threats in the study that we did. Some struggles and philosophical differences, conflicts, high political aspects of the role of school-based police officers, school resource officers, as they're often known, and an increase in school safety litigation. There are many weeks where I get more calls from attorneys than I do from superintendents and school administrators seeking services on a proactive end. And that's probably been one of my more interesting observations in recent years, is that school safety is moving from the schoolhouse to the courthouse legally, as well as into the court of public opinion. So as administrators, principals, superintendents, school boards, as support personnel, what we do, what we write, what we say does make a difference. It's a case where people know what questions to ask. If not, they're hiring experts who can tell them what they need to ask. So we have to do our best to do the right thing and to acknowledge that we have to take the time and effort to try to do this to a point of reasonableness. We can't say, well, we didn't know that school safety is an issue. We didn't have time to do that. And while budgets are limited, we can't just summarily dismiss things because we didn't have a budget. We have to say what's reasonable, what is the context that we have, did we have a reasonable plan and steps to deal with things, and what evidence and action did we take to deal with that. So I'd like to take a look at the first piece with the tunnel vision focus on active shooters. The attack at Sandy Hook, now almost 5 years ago, certainly shifted the focus back in, at that point, a post-Columbine era, from 1999 to a point where it was a punch in the gut, perhaps the most severe that we've had. Columbine was obviously a landmark watershed type issue in school safety, but I think Sandy Hook even had caused a more visceral punch in the gut reaction from those of us who are parents, from everyone across the U.S. and internationally. And it added to that ongoing theme that we see in the media and public discourse and public safety today about the active shooter, the mass shootings. We've seen it most recently with the church shooting this weekend and past weekend in Texas. We saw it in the Las Vegas shooting several weeks ago. We obviously saw it in the school end with Sandy Hook 5 years ago. And these are important events. They're things that we should be prepared for. Active shooters should be a threat that we recognize. Active shooters should be something we prepare for. But some of the problem with that is that we also end up with a tunnel vision focus. And every time there's a high profile active shooter case in the news, in the forefront of our minds, there's a political and a communication and a school community relations aspect to that, where as school leaders, we have to acknowledge and reinforce to our parents, the media, and our school community that we are taking steps to prepare for a worst case scenario, an active shooter situation. And there can be an enormous amount of pressure on school administrators and school boards to deal with the emotional aspect, the punch in the gut, the emotional concerns that parents have that are legitimate to a point of reasonableness, but are also fueled by intense media coverage and just the anxiety and fear about something that to a large extent we don't have control over. In other words, quite frankly, we don't have 100% control of it or even close to that. But the context of that also is that fortunately, the vast majority of schools in this country will never experience an active shooter. One case is one too many, but we also have to realize that on a continuum of threats, there are many types of threats that not only face school administrators and school leaders and safety officials, but are also more likely to occur than an active shooter. One of the things that we'll talk about later, as you see here in this slide, in this story, from a couple years back, was the active shooter drills are actually sparking legal complaints, lawsuits, school staff members who are injured. There's one report that an insurance company out west has paid out more than $1 million in workers' comp claims just from school employees who were injured in active shooter training, not in actual active shooter incidents, in training programs. There's the psychological piece of dealing with having active shooter drills and these types of programs that beg the question of what's age and developmentally appropriate. Where is that line of reasonableness that you could cross with some of these drills from being proactive, crossing over into doing more harm than good? There's the issue of how we implement drills, how we do them at different grade levels. So there are a lot of considerations here in terms of what's realistic and practical. And we need to make sure that while we want to be prepared and we want to act, we also don't want to overreact or do things halfway or try to create the perception that we're doing something that's truly meaningful when we're only kind of doing it flying by the seat of our pants in a one-time training that could set us up for greater safety risks, a false sense of security, and a potential liability than if we had taken a more balanced, realistic, and practical approach. And the other aspect of this is taking a look at the model that we use, National School Safety Security Services, looking at school safety threats on a continuum. If you look at this continuum we've put together, and you go from the left to the right, there are just a number of points on that continuum of school safety threats. On the far left, we have routine disciplinary issues that schools may face on a day-to-day basis. Verbal aggression, the threats, menacing, harassment, inappropriate verbal aggression. Bullying comes in many forms, as we know, from cyberbullying to physical, to exclusion, to taunting and teasing, to fights, physical fights, altercations, physical conflicts. We have non-custodial parent issues, abductions, but custody issues are one of the biggest concerns still at the elementary school level, more so on average than an active shooter concern. Threats, bomb threats, shooting threats, weather or natural disasters, and then to the extreme far right, an active shooter or even a terrorist attack on a school. And as you look at this, what's happened, particularly in the post-Sandy Hook era, is that I've seen the focus become very tunnel vision on the far right section on shootings. The focus has been on the active shooter, the threat of the active shooter, and we've gotten a tunnel vision focus in many schools on the shooter. And with the limited amount of time we have for professional development training and drills and exercises, the activities and the focus on threats have tended to be around that school shooting. I have a lot of school administrators who will tell me at conferences and different times I encounter them professionally or when we're working with them doing security assessments or tabletops, they'll be quick to point out, well, we've had an active shooter drill. We've done several active shooter drills at our school. And I've started asking building principals, when's the last time you did a drill for a non-custodial parent abduction or student release? Now, there may not be an actual drill per se, but when did you have that conversation? because that particular threat is much more likely to occur, particularly at an elementary school level, than an active shooter ever will at that school. Have we had that conversation? We've been in schools over the couple decades that we've worked with schools during security assessments, where we've walked into a school in a district when we're working on a district-wide assessment, and the crisis team and principal will tell us, well, we've done active shooters, and here's the drills that we have, and here's some of the things that we're doing, and they spend a whole lot of time on that. But their school's actually positioned with a railroad track just on the back of the property line. And when we ask them what they've done for a hazmat issue, or if they know what's transported on that railway, they have no idea. They've never had those conversations. They've never had an opportunity to reach out to, or they've never taken an opportunity to reach out to the railroad officials. And it has never been on their radar screen, when in reality, that's probably one of the biggest threats that they may potentially face in terms of some type of incident, just due to the proximity of where they're located. So if you look at the school safety threat continuum, understand that active shooters are important. They're an issue, but they are one point of many on a school safety threat continuum. It actually includes a number of other little points we don't have here in this illustration that you could fill up on different threats. And if you view your response from a school safety perspective, from the continuum of prevention to preparedness, the same concept applies there. If you look left to right, prevention programs, classroom management programs, school discipline, intervention supports, mental health services, psychological services, student supports, conflict mediation, intervention type programs, whatever the intervention services may be, health, physical health, mental health, to staff development, professional development and training, to security staffing and school police, school resource officers, tabletop exercises where you do hypothetical scenarios, work through those as school crisis teams, district crisis teams, and with your school community first responder partner agencies. Drills, lockdowns, evacuations, shelter in place. Active shooter training, perhaps a full-scale drill involving your first responders on a broader exercise level, all the way up to full-scale exercises that are community-based disasters. So if you look at that response continuum, active shooters, once again, is one point of many on a continuum. And I'll flip back on this slide, and again, here's our threat continuum. It's wide. It contains many points. Active shooters is one. And our threat in our prevention and preparedness continuum, again, is wide, it's broad, and active shooters are one point on there. And it's very important that we frame this issue as school crisis teams and school first responders and school administrators to explain this, to articulate this, to communicate it, to create a framework as we build a comprehensive and balanced school safety plan, so that we don't get tunnel vision on one area. And I can tell you that in litigation cases and forensic analysis, and I've worked on mass school shootings cases to rape, sexual assault, violent attacks with injuries, abduction of a child from elementary school who was sexually assaulted, in a number of other cases. The allegations, some of them unsubstantiated, some of them legitimate, and we work with both plaintiff and defense attorneys in evaluating cases at both state and federal court levels. One of the common threads, while each of those cases have their own facts, have to be evaluated on their own unique circumstances, may or may not be founded as having legitimate alleged concerns from a legal end. But one of the common threads is that they involve allegations of failures of people and failures of procedures versus allegations of failures of equipment, hardware, and products. And that's very important. So we have to remember that that we're not going to get that quick fix where it's a skewed focus on equipment and hardware. And it's the people end that often ends up in question when we have what many of us know the phrase the perfect storm, when all of those negative things that could happen fall in place at one time to create the perfect storm, and a crisis or a critical incident occurs. A school administrator at a private school in the Midwest that I was working with had used the phrase cascading errors, when you have a series of cascading errors that leads to a critical event. And just some of the examples here, you have a case from several years ago, back in 2013 in the San Diego area, where a jury awarded a father more than $2 million due to a inappropriate release of his young son from a school who was taken and kidnapped across the border to Mexico. I've seen more often than I certainly want to see, which one is one too many, some inappropriate release of student cases that ends up in the news. Again, just a couple of examples. Man who allegedly took girl from school indicted for interfering with child custody. Also student walkaways. Brooklyn child with autism leaves school unnoticed, found on rooftop several blocks away. These are the day-to-day safety issues, the security issues, the question of supervision issues, where that can lead to a sad, unfortunate, and critical incident that will eventually be critiqued, should they occur, as to whether or not there are reasonable steps to prevent that and to prepare for managing that effectively, and if there was negligence involved along that way. So please take a look at your active shooter plans. Make sure that's part of your comprehensive approach, but don't get the tunnel vision in looking at those issues alone as the threat or as your only or primary focus of preparedness and response. Second area I wanted to share some points about is the skewed focus on security products, equipment, and physical security. I've alluded to that in the conversation so far with you today. And I want to just take a closer look at that, particularly after the Sandy Hook attack back in 2012. The business side of physical security, security equipment and hardware has ramped up from a number of ways. First of all, there is, after a high-profile incident, there tends to be a political maneuver at some level, state, sometimes federal, although not really after the Sandy Hook. It became more of a gun control, gun rights debate rather than a best practices debate at the federal level after Sandy Hook. But at the state level after Sandy Hook, we saw a number of states that threw out some one-time or short-term grants for school security equipment, a few million here, a few million there, one-time shot in the arm, maybe a couple of repeat annual grants like that. So school districts clamored to get some of that free money that hadn't been there and to get some resources in their districts. And a lot of times we would see, since Sandy Hook, upgrades in surveillance camera systems and fortifying the front entrance ways and other types of physical security measures, some of the gadgets and such that are out there. But the problem is it was a very skewed focused approach. Conversation was not as much on the other aspects of prevention and intervention and training and professional development. It was a quick fix to throw up some cameras, fortify the front doorways, hold a press conference, send a letter home and tell parents that we were doing something about school safety. Well, we are. Those are some elements and aspects of a comprehensive approach if used properly. But we've also seen reports in cases where cameras that were put in under these one-time shot in the arm funding efforts, 2 or 3 years later, the cameras are down, they're broken, they're not working. The building principal has no budget to repair or replace those cameras. The central office, business office, or superintendent's office has no money for that. So you have a school that had cameras put in earlier where parents are under the impression they're working, that in many times they're not working, they're not functioning. There have been some investigative news reports where reporters have actually done public records requests from school business offices for repair orders to take a look at how long repair orders have sat in the business office where cameras in schools have gone unrepaired, and in many cases it's been for months, and in some cases years, in those investigative reports. As an example here, after a reported rape inside a Kansas City public school, problems were uncovered with the $1 million security camera system that were not working on the days of a reported rape. How that equipment is put in, installed, and used, this is where I can't hear everyone, but I'm sure there's some chuckles as you look at this picture. But there are many times in doing security assessments of schools over the years, for a couple decades now, we've seen some things and we go, why did they put that there? What was the purpose? What was the intent? What problem were you trying to address? Why did this happen? And how did it happen this way? And there aren't always good answers. There are answers a lot of times we hear, well, the school board allocated X number of thousands of dollars for cameras. Somebody came in and determined that we were getting X number of cameras, and they came in and put them in places they thought we needed them, and nobody ever talked with us. Well, that's not really having a meaningful program. So any type of equipment, security equipment, needs to be a supplement to, but not a substitute for, the human aspect and a comprehensive approach to school safety. As you look at equipment, you should considerations for your schools. You should ask, what is the problem, the threat, the concern that we are trying to address by the use of equipment? Is it access control? Is it communications? Is it surveillance and monitoring and deterrence with cameras in a certain area? And my thought on cameras has always been, when people ask, and particularly the media, well, do cameras deter? My answer is, cameras deter those who are deterrable, and they hopefully serve as evidence in cases for those who are not. But we also get what we call the CSI effect. And school officials need to be very cautious when you put in cameras and you present that to the community sort of as the here, see, we're doing something type response, that you realize that you've now created an expectation in your school community that if anything happens, somebody's going to catch it on a camera. Our CSI effect from the TV shows have created the impression, many times false impression, that all the crimes are going to be solved by cameras, and the technology is going to be perfect, the images will be pristine, and we're going to catch the bad guy or bad girl thanks to those cameras, no matter what the offense. The reality is, in our schools, we know those cameras cover limited areas. They're limited in numbers. In many cases, we've seen the quality of the equipment that's purchased through school-based or school district purchasing is not the best equipment, or not the most greatest technology that's available, or maybe the cheapest, based on, or who knows why it may be in there. So when a parent comes, a few months after you have your first incident, and then you have to tell them, no, we didn't capture that sexual assault in the back hallway. We're not even sure we could tell who the kids were that were walking in that direction around that time. You have a whole different school community relations issue to deal with. So we have to be careful not to create a false sense of security and misunderstandings on what we can realistically accomplish with technology. Again, it's a tool. It's not a panacea. Another area that we've seen trending is just an uptick anecdotally of sexual assaults, gun confiscations, and teen suicide issues. It's anecdotal. I say it that way. It's something I'm very comfortable in saying. I'm saying monitoring nationally, but it's also qualified with the statement that we have no real federal mandatory school crime reporting and tracking law in this country. So in terms of hard numbers, we really don't know, in terms of incident-based numbers, how many crimes occur on an incident-based tracking system in our schools across the country. The federal data is based on a collection of hodgepodge academic surveys, self-reporting research data, academic studies, and they kind of take it all, throw it together in a pot, come up with an annual indicators report, and present that as stats on school crime, and many times saying that school crime's down. While I don't think we want to overstate it, the way I characterize it, rather, is that federal statistics and state statistics tend to grossly underestimate the extent of school violence. Public perception and the media tend to overstate it. In reality, somewhere in between, but in real numbers, we really don't know where that in between is, particularly on a national basis. So your best approach is to collect your data, if as best you can, at the school-based and district-based and community-based levels. Try to establish some common language and common tracking and agreed upon methods for documenting, and then analyzing that data on a regular basis, annual basis, or however you decide, so that you can look for particular trends. That said, I have seen just monitoring national news in the last year or so, and certainly this school district is no exception, an uptick in the confiscation of firearms in schools, not only unloaded, as is often historically been the case, but also loaded guns. And while you see the AR-15 slide here in front of you from one news report in Daytona Beach in Florida, that's not necessarily representative, obviously, of what we see in schools. Most of them, of course, would be handguns, many of them coming from the homes. But we've seen a number of cases like this one, weapons. School police say number of weapons on campuses alarming, 11 guns and 8 pellet guns during a given point in time. There's just a story yesterday out on the wire that I put on our school safety news channel, which is facebook.com/school safety, if you want to follow regular monitoring of some of the stories from across the country, and I'll give you that at the end of the presentation, where there were 8 gun incidents in a short period of time out in California in the Bay Area. In this case, every now and then you pop up with an unusual case, and a kindergarten teacher arrested after gun found in classrooms. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about the political aspects of arming teachers. I think it's a high-risk, high-liability proposition. I think that there are a number of those high-risk, high-liability propositions that of teaching kids and teachers to throw things and attack heavily armed gunmen, arming teachers, bulletproof backpacks. I think that there are a lot of implementation concerns and issues that may be well intended but not well thought out. But in this case, I showed this just to point out to people that you may encounter some unusual incidents. You may encounter some unusual circumstances where we're not just talking about children who bring guns to school, or adolescents who bring guns to school, but you could possibly, in today's world, have an issue where you have a staff member who does so in an unauthorized way. And are you prepared to deal with it? It doesn't occur every day in every school, but this slide that I have here is one of a number of incidents that I've seen, so it's not unheard of. And I think administratively we need to have a conversation about what would we do if we encountered that. Associated Press did a year-long study of sex assaults, rapes, sexual assaults in K through 12 schools that sends shockwaves around the country in the media industry and caused many school districts to take a look at, many local media outlets to take a look at their own local school districts, kind of localize this national story, as they would say. And the issue of rapes and sexual assaults in school is really a problem. It hasn't been quantified and talked about on a national level. It's been more of a conversation at colleges and universities. But I can tell you that from a litigation end, in addition to wrongful death cases and violent attacks and injuries, a good number of inquiries and conversations I have with attorneys are on cases of rape and other sexual assaults in K through 12 school settings. So unfortunately, again, this was one of those conversations where I ask people when they talk about active shooters, I said, well, that's great. I'm glad you've had those conversations. but have you also had conversations about supervision, about hallways and restrooms and areas after school and in isolated areas of the building, and supervision issues where you could possibly have a sexual assault at your school? And how would you handle that? What protocols do you have in place for reporting, notifying the police, documenting administrative investigations, of course, with law enforcement having the priority in investigating those incidents when they're crimes? So I think we need to have those conversations as well. And again, it's another example of something beyond just the active shooter that's a concern. Also, suicide. One of the things I've seen is an uptick in teen suicides. I know that PSI and our good friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Poland, who is a PSI expert resource and is a very good friend of mine and Steve Rosenberg's as well. And this PSI is the guru on school suicide. I can tell you that from a security end, I've seen these suicides that historically would take place outside of the school but impact the school community. I've seen a number of them actually now occurring at the schools. I don't have a hard number on that, and I defer to Scott in terms of his expertise. But I think it's something we need to be aware of, that it's maybe occurring in school or on school grounds now more than perhaps in the past, where it was something that happened at home and we brought in psychological services and counseling to the school to help that with that community-based incident that now affected the school. So that's something to, again, get back into supervision, about reporting, about dealing with situations where kids feel comfortable to come forward and talk to an adult that they trust about a threat, a concern, a safety issue, something at a peer, a friend, another student has said in terms of threatening or unusual behavior or suicidal tendencies, and that we follow through on that. There was a case just out of Illinois within the past year that's drawn some national attention, with a student who had been alleged to have in some way recorded a consensual sex act outside of a school setting, was confronted by the school resource officer and the school administrator when that recording became known to school officials, according to news reports on this matter. I'm not directly involved in this on any litigation, so I'm just sharing the public reports. And that student was in the custody of school officials. The parent was eventually contacted and was on the way to the school. The student somehow left the office and ended up committing suicide before the parent arrived. So suicide issues are real. They're concerned, and with the stressors and mental health challenges for our kids as well as our adults and families today, I think it's one of the other safety issues we need to monitor closely. In terms of threats, bomb threats, to some extent school shooting threats, we've seen an uptick in these, and we conducted a study during a defined period in 2015 and put out that report in 2016, where we looked at more than 800 violent school threats. It's on our website at schoolsecurity.org. Many of those threats were bomb threats, and we found some interesting data as a result of this study. It came from an analysis of primarily news incidents that we saw across the country, but it shed a lot of light on it. About 70% of those incidents we looked at involved bomb and/or bomb and shooting threats. A large number of them were bomb threats, though. And what we found is that out of those 800 plus incidents, about 30% of those, 37% of those incidents were sent electronically. And that, I think, is an important shift of what we've seen in the past. For those of us who are old enough to remember phone booths that were down the street from the schools, or payphones where people called, it's kind of a foreign object now for our youth and many of our younger parents, as far as that goes. That's not the type of calls we're getting anymore. The bomb threats, I should qualify that and say we they do get those calls, calls from phones, hardline phones and such. But a significant shift here has been an uptick in electronic threats, social media threats, different types of apps, social media apps, proxy servers. When we found there's a phenomenon known as swatting, S-W-A-T-T-I-N-G, not the type that used to be used in a disciplinary perspective in school, but swatting is computerized threats that are called in oftentimes from across state and even international borders targeting schools. Bomb threats that are called in with what's often referred to as computerized sounding, robotic sounding voices, as secretaries and other people who take the calls at schools describe them. This electronic threats, it really puts a new change on it in terms of how school administrators have to not only investigate those threats, but social media also comes into play, because rumors and misinformation about those threats spreads like wildfire in minutes and hours, where parents are flocking to the schools. They're calling the school, they're showing up on the doorstep, local media is getting the information. So school administrators now have to be prepared to manage not only the investigation of the threat in cooperation with law enforcement, but they also have to manage the crisis communications aspect of these threats, and do so simultaneously. In decades past, years past, school administrators and law enforcement would receive a bomb threat call, they'd investigate it, they'd come to their conclusion of analyzing it and identifying the perpetrators, and then they may send home a letter to parents. Today, school officials are working on lockdowns, having plans for evacuations, having social media and communication strategies, dealing with crisis communications, having parents show up on the doorstep, and all of this is going on along with media calls before administrators can actually investigate and identify where this threat was posted online, having any type of idea of how to start tracing that as far as law enforcement end. So you're having dual challenges of managing the investigation and managing the communications crisis. And the three recommendation areas that we came out with from this research is, number one, schools need to have threat assessment teams, training, and protocols. They should be able to be prepared to hit the ground running if you receive a threat, so that you're not trying to figure out how you're going to approach it while you're standing out in the parking lot, or inside the front hallway after you receive your first threat. Should be training, some hypothetical tabletop exercises, scenarios, reviews of protocols, for example, are things to consider, so that you know as a team how you're going to function if you have a real life threat. Second area is that school officials should have plans for quote-unquote heightened security while investigations are going on. Some of these investigations may be quick. You may find that somebody writes a threat on the bathroom wall. You use your school surveillance cameras to figure out which students were in the hallway at the time, bring them in, do the good old footwork of a dean, assistant principal, or principal, school resource officer, find out who did it, and you're done by the end of the school day. Other cases may take days or even weeks for law enforcement investigation, the involvement of federal law enforcement, not just your local law enforcement, and investigations that could span across state lines or international borders if it's a swatting incident. And while this goes on, it's not uncommon to have repeat threats, number one, and number two, to have increased anxiety in the school community, where you and law enforcement have done an assessment, you don't feel that there's an imminent immediate threat, but you're still getting additional threats and the investigations going on, and parents are looking for heightened security. So you need to have conversations ahead of time as to, what does this mean? What does heightened security look like? What does it mean in our school community? Increased supervision during hallway class changes, outside at arrival and dismissal, additional police patrols at arrival and dismissal and during the school day, additional staffing of police or security personnel if necessary, tighter controls on access to the building, etc. But have a plan of what heightened security looks like. And then the third part is to have crisis communications plans and social media strategies in place so that you can communicate while not on a level playing field because you'll always be behind, but you need to have crisis communications plans and social media strategies to at least narrow that gap, to reduce and manage the rumors and misinformation, and to get accurate information out as the credible source to your parents and school community and media through your channels, through your Facebook pages and Twitter feeds, and through your communications and releases and mass notification systems and letters that go home, so that you can manage that community anxiety while you're also managing the threat investigation. Another area that's hot that I'll touch on very briefly, here's the role of school-based police. It's walking a tightrope in many areas today. Police community relations are strained in many communities. There are racial implications and undertones in a broader societal debate about the role of policing, community policing, racial tensions, disparate arrests, and the school to prison pipeline, as it's called, for arrests that occur on school grounds by school-based officers, and whether or not some of those arrests cross the line of traditional disciplinary matters that should be handled by an assistant principal or principal and are then handled by a police officer. I'm a strong supporter of school resource officers, school resource officer programs. I believe that school resource officers do much more in terms of prevention than they do arrest. I do believe that we can do some credible work in reducing this tightrope and this anxiety and these questions about questionable arrests in schools, though, by making sure that we follow those best practices for school-based policing in terms of officer selection, officer supervision, memorandum of understanding, agreements, officer training, officer evaluation, school administrator training and evaluation on their role in working with school-based police, and making sure that they're following the triad model of having the officer perform as number one, a law enforcement officer, number two, a school-based, a counseling type role, a mentor counseling type role, and number three, as a law-related educator, where they're doing some instruction with kids in classrooms and on different types of issues with cyberbullying, date rape, and other types of issues that may come into play. I touched upon the issue of school safety litigation, and again, I'd just like to stress that as we look at these issues, it begs the question, is there a direction of school safety where there's a clear relationship? If we have decreased prevention, intervention, security, preparedness, and training in our schools for school safety, is that why we may be seeing increased serious incidents, lawsuits, parent and media concerns on school safety? I think that anecdotally, that's something that I think is credible idea, and I truly believe that the fewer resources, both in time and money, that we put into school safety and prevention efforts, the more we're going to see more serious incidents, litigation, and incidents and parent concerns played out in the media. I'd like to just quickly go through here in the last 5 minutes or so that we have a few key points and reminders of some best practices. The first and best line of defense is a well-trained, highly alert staff and student body. You can't get past that with a quick fix with equipment. School safety is truly everyone's job, from the secretary and school custodian. Train your support staff. We need to make sure that we train our support staff in school, because a lot of times they're not an integral part of the program. Supervision of children. Those issues often come into play in litigation. Kids need order, structure, and discipline, and that discipline should be firm, fair, and consistently and applied with good common sense. Deal with small problems while they're small problems. The fourth R in education is relationships with kids. Kids come forward and tell when there are weapons or threats in schools, not just metal detectors and equipment. We can't change the climate if we don't change the conversation. If you're not talking about safety and emergency preparedness, you're doing a disservice and you're not really making any changes. And those crisis plans should not just be up on a shelf collecting dust. You need to plan, prepare, and practice, and again, focus on the fundamentals. and I touched upon the importance of having communications plans and communicating proactively to keep calm and talk about safety proactively with parents and the school community and the media to let them know what you're doing before a crisis ever occurs in your school. Because if they hear about safety from you proactively, they'll be more trustful of you when you're reacting to a particular incident. I'll point to a couple resources here from our website and from PSI, but I'd just like to open up to see if we have any questions at this point in time. It's sort of a quick overview with a lot of different points, but does anybody have any particular question you'd like addressed now?
Thank you so much, Ken. We really have time probably just for one question, so I'll just arbitrarily choose this one. Funding is often a concern pointed to by school boards and administrators when discussing school security and emergency preparedness. How can schools address school safety in times of tighter budgets?
It's actually important to look at school safety as not only a budget issue. Some things have costs, but that's physical security. But more importantly, the time. The reality is school administrators today fight more for competition of time than they do money in any cases. And school safety has to be a leadership issue. We tell people to take the 5-minute rule. Take 5 minutes at the end of every faculty or departmental meeting or superintendent's cabinet meeting to talk about one aspect of school safety and emergency planning. Keep it on the agenda. Talk with parents. Do some training. Make those tough calls that if you have a day of professional development that you're going to put at least an hour or so on safety in addition to everything else. Be proactive, not reactive, and make sure that you're giving the time for meetings, planning, and drills as much as you're worried about the money. A lot of things need to be done that really involve more time.
Okay, thank you. I just want to give a few more instructions here. We really hope you found this webinar useful to the audience and that you'll participate in our future PSI webinars. Once this webinar is completely over, you will immediately receive a survey. You'll just see it up there on your screen. If you attended this webinar in its entirety and you submit this completed survey, you will receive a certificate of attendance from PSI. Please allow at least a week before expecting your certificate that will be emailed to you at the address that you provided for us. And if you have any questions or would like additional information on any PSI service, our contact information is right there on the final screen. Once again, thank you so much, Ken Trump, and thank you to all of you who participated in attending.
Thank you, Karen.